In this tutorial, we'll take a look at how to make creative hair using Corel Painter 2015. So in our first example here, we have some liquid ink hair. You can see it gives you a really nice splattered ink kind of traditional media effect. This is using the liquid ink brush technology in Corel Painter. In our next example, we have some particle hair. This was made using the particle brushes in Corel Painter 2015. And in our third example, we have another example of painting hair with the particle brushes, but this time I'm using some brushes that I created originally for leaves and grass. They also work really well for making this nice chunky hair. So I'll go ahead and walk you through drawing each of these three effects. Let's go ahead and start with the liquid ink hair. You'll want to locate the ink hair brush, which is down here in the water and ink palette. And as soon as you paint with this brush, it's going to automatically create a special layer type for liquid ink, and you can only paint liquid ink on liquid ink layers, so just make sure that if you want to be editing the paint that you're working on, that you're on the liquid ink layer, because as soon as you try to paint with another brush, it's going to give you an error message. So let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to sample one of these colors by holding Alt. I'm just going to paint some long sweeping strokes. You should be getting something like this. Now what makes this liquid ink layer special is that the ink kind of clumps together naturally as liquid would, and if you choose the graphic bristle resist brush, you can erase that ink. It gives you a more natural result, especially if you tap, so you can work kind of back and forth to get this nice spotty ink look. So I'm going to go ahead and just start painting in some hair. This particular brush uses your pen pressure, so if you use lighter pressure, you get a thinner line, and if you use heavier pressure, you get a thick line. You want to kind of vary your pressure here and paint in the direction that you want your hair to flow. So I'm going to have it kind of flow down the forehead and kind of start to part around by the side of the head. I want to make sure that I fill in the side here next to the face. So I'm just doing one long continuous stroke just to fill in some of these big thick areas. And then I'll pull some strands off of that, like so. You can change your brush size bigger, but don't make it too big, because it might start to get a little slow when you paint. Let's go ahead and add some hair on the other side. I'm going to create a new layer. Now you could keep your hair all on the same layer if you want, if you don't have this color separation, but since I'm trying to separate these two colors, I'm going to create a new layer so that the two colors don't blend together. If I paint on that same layer with the blue, the ink kind of bleeds together in a way that I don't like. So I like the effect that I get if I put that ink on its own layer, it doesn't blend together in the same way. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill that in, just like I did before. Just make sure it's nice and filled in the background first. And then go ahead and draw your strands off of that. I'm building up these strokes because sometimes when I make a stroke it doesn't put down enough ink, and so I just keep going over it again and again until it fills in the way I want it to. Might go ahead and fill in the hairline a little more here, like so. Have a few strands that kind of come down in front of the face. If you use light pressure, you get kind of a more spotty result. If you use heavier pressure, you get a thicker line. I'm going to go back to that other layer. Let's go ahead and just name these layers. This layer that's in between is just a way to keep these layers separate. So this is actually just a layer that you could delete if you want to. So we'll go back to that blue ink layer, and let's go ahead and sample that blue color. Let's fill in the hairline a little bit more. I think that looks better. Now we can continue adding layers of color, but we want to create a new layer in between so that it'll put our ink on its own new layer. So I'm going to sample one of these lighter blues from the face. And we'll add in some of this. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller so that I'm drawing with some smaller details here. Let's go ahead and sample one of these brighter reds. Let's create a new layer so that we separate our layers. We'll delete these in between layers here because we don't need these, and we'll just name our layers. We'll create a new layer to separate our layers, and let's select one of these orange colors from the face. We'll add in some of that. And as you work, you want to make sure that you have a good balance of contrast. So I want to use just a little bit of highlight compared to how much shadow I used. I want there to be a lot of shadow in the hair for this particular piece. And so these highlights, I want to be kind of smaller and thinner. Let's create another layer, and let's select one of these yellows, and let's add a tiny bit of that as well. Just very little of it. We'll add a new layer, we'll go over to the other side, and we'll add in some lighter blue over there. We'll go ahead and delete these extra layers that we don't need anymore. Now if we want to, we can go in and modify some of these layers. For instance, we could go to this blue ink layer, which is the darker blue, and we could use this graphic bristle resist if we wanted to try to erase from it a little bit to create kind of an interesting weathered effect. Do the same on the other side to that red ink. You can also experiment with the drops of ink brush. Let's go ahead and add a new layer so that we can put this stuff on its own layer. We'll just tap with this brush. You can see you get little dots of ink. You can draw with it too, and you can get kind of a lumpy effect, but I think it works better if you just tap. Let's sample this red. Let's put a few dots on the other side so that we get a little bit of mixing going on between the colors. I'll add in a couple dots of yellow here and there, a few dots of that bright red. We'll do a few blue dots on the other side. And then if you wanted to do any work on this, let's say blend it or use any other brushes that aren't a liquid ink brush, what you're gonna have to do is you're gonna have to convert these to default layers. So you can right click on the layer and you can convert it to a default layer individually, or the faster way to do it is just to go ahead and select all of those ink layers if you're done with them as being individual layers. You can just merge them with Control E, and then they automatically merge together and become a default layer. So for instance, I could use the coarse oily blender and I could blend this a little bit. If you want to preserve your ink layers and keep them editable as liquid ink layers, you need to make sure that you save only as Paint or Riff. Because if you save as Photoshop, the Photoshop format doesn't support liquid ink layers. They'll automatically get converted to default layers, and then you won't be able to go in and edit them as if they were liquid ink with the graphic bristle resist brush and so on.